All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a super sensitive but incredibly relevant case study that really forces us to look at that exact line where free speech collides with strict legal boundaries. We are going to unpack the events of May 2024 at the University of Vienna, where a student encampment sparked this massive, fierce debate about the limits of protest. And look, we're going to examine this completely impartially. We're relying directly on official court documents, state security reports, and interviews with university leadership to figure out exactly what went down.
So this brings us to the big question, right? Where exactly is the line between free speech and a threat to public safety? Throughout this analysis, we're kind of looking at this through a scales of justice lens. On one side, we've got fundamental civil liberties, the right to assemble, to protest, to voice dissent and opinions. But then on the exact opposite side, we have state security, the absolute obligation of authorities to prevent radicalization, protect citizens, and keep public order. How does a modern democracy actually balance those two incredibly heavy weights when tensions are literally at a boiling point?
To unpack all of this, here's our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover a history of campus protests, the May 2024 encampment itself, what the protesters actually demanded, the tipping point, the boundaries of free speech, and finally, the broader implications. Okay, Section 1, a history of campus protests. Let's look at the University of Vienna's legacy of activism. Now, you've got to remember, universities have always been incubators for massive, sometimes super disruptive social debates. What happened in 2024 didn't just pop out of nowhere, It's part of a really long-standing tradition of student mobilization at this specific school. Current events are anchored deeply in their recent history. Take October 2009. Students occupied the Audimax, which is the largest lecture hall there. Out of that huge grassroots protest, they birthed a 1,000-copy magazine called Morgan to act as their mouthpiece. By January 2010, thanks to some copyright hiccups, they cleverly rebranded to Übermorgen, meaning the day after tomorrow. Fast forward a bit to 2022, and hundreds of students occupied a hall again, this time under the banner Earth is Burning, demanding stricter climate action. So the key takeaway here is that sitting in, occupying space, organizing, this is fundamentally woven into the campus DNA. Moving right along to Section 2, the May 2024 encampment, a 72-hour microcosm of a global debate. So as protests over the war in Gaza blew up at major U.S. schools like Columbia and Harvard, the movement quickly crossed the pond, hitting Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, Oxford, and eventually the courtyard of the University of Vienna. Let's walk through this rapid 72-hour timeline of the Palestine Solidarity encampment, pulling straight from official police and court records. On May 6th, right around 5:45 p.m., a rainy gathering of about 80 to 100 people escalated. They started pitching tents and stringing up tarps in the Altus AKH campus. By the afternoon of the 7th, megaphone speeches and organized chants kicked off, drawing a ton of media and even more participants. And then, completely abruptly, late evening on May 8th at exactly 11:02 p.m., the police stepped in and ordered the entire assembly to disperse. But what was it actually like inside the camp during those 3 days? Well, court documents detail these highly organized internal rules that were blasted over megaphones to the group. They were incredibly disciplined, but also highly secretive. The rules covered basics like keeping the camp clean and a strict ban on alcohol and drugs. But they also laid out explicit instructions. Wear masks to hide your identity, put your phones on airplane mode, which stops digital tracking but keeps the camera ready to film police, and absolutely no talking to the police. This really gives us a clear picture of an organized group that was fully anticipating friction with the authorities. Which brings us to Section 3, the protesters' demands. What did the encampment actually want? These guys weren't just out there venting vague anger. They sent formal, explicit demands to the administration. Let's impartially run through these 5 core goals straight from the court docs, just so we completely understand their political aims. First, demilitarize. They demanded the university cut all research ties with defense funds and arms manufacturers. Second, boycott. They wanted an end to partnerships and Erasmus programs with Israeli universities. Third, disclose and divest from any institutions contributing to the conflict. Fourth, end police cooperation, specifically stopping security research programs tied to state intelligence. And finally, number 5, stop repression, halting what they viewed as censorship tactics and police deployments against students. All right, Section 4, the tipping point. This is where rhetoric meets state security. Look, demands alone don't usually shut down a protest. We have to pinpoint the exact catalyst that made the university and the Austrian police question if this gathering was even legal anymore. And there's a massive, massive friction here between two totally conflicting interpretations. On one side, protesters labeled their event a student intifada camp and chanted, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." For them, these are expressions of solidarity, liberation, resistance. But flip to the other side, and we have the Austrian State Security and Intelligence Directorate, the DSN. The DSN flagged that since Hamas, which is a recognized terrorist organization, frequently calls for an intifada, using that term and those slogans could potentially violate Section 282A of the Austrian Criminal Code. That's the law dealing with the public condoning or glorification of terrorism. That disagreement right there, that was the exact flashpoint.
And this tension wasn't just some legal hypothetical. It was deeply felt on the ground. Take the rector of the university, Sebastian Schutze. In an interview, he made it clear, saying, "As a university, we have to prioritize the safety of our Jewish students and staff." He elaborated that, sure, a university has to allow protests, and legitimate criticism of a government is totally fine. But when rhetoric shifts into a zone that carries anti-Semitic undertones, it crosses a line. For the leadership, ending a protest is a last resort, but they truly felt a hard boundary was being crossed.
Section 5. Boundaries of free speech. Let's look at the legal aftermath and the court ruling. Okay, we're shifting gears now. We're moving from the politics of the campus courtyard straight into a strict, objective legal review in the courtroom. Because, get this, after the camp was shut down, one of the participants actually sued the police over the eviction, so the state's judicial system had to step in as the ultimate referee. The judge had to look at the timeline and carefully weigh the constitutional right to freedom of assembly against the police's mandate to maintain public safety. First up, the court looked at how the eviction actually went down. Late night, May 8th, the police roll in. The court documents reveal that the 40 or so remaining participants were given literally 15 minutes to clear out a camp they'd been living in for 3 days. It was this abrupt, zero-hour police action under the threat of arrest, which meant a lot of people had to just abandon their tents and belongings. The police defended this by saying the camp had basically morphed into a breeding ground for the endorsement of terrorism. But then, months later, we get this massive legal twist. The verdict from the Vienna Administrative Court declared the police dispersal of the assembly completely, strictly unlawful. Yeah, unlawful. The court ruled that the police action actually violated the fundamental human right to freedom of assembly. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth did the judge reach that conclusion when state security had explicitly flagged the rhetoric? Let's break down the judge's reasoning here, because it's fascinating. The court basically said, look, there is no concrete evidence that an entire group of 40 to 150 people was endorsing terrorism just because a slogan was chanted by a few individuals. On top of that, the extensive police logs showed the camp was largely peaceful. Students were attending lectures, watching movies. Crucially, the court pointed out that police only issued a single warning about the problematic chants on May 7th, and the protesters actually listened and stopped chanting it. Finally, the judge ruled there just wasn't enough dialogue. Having mere intelligence suspicions about certain slogans is not enough to justify a massive late-night eviction without at least trying to talk to the protesters first to gauge their actual intent. Essentially, the court said the police legally overreacted. Finally, Section 6, the broader implications. Universities in the crossfire? Let's zoom back out for a second. What does this one specific ruling in Vienna mean for the wider global struggle over campus speech? Universities literally everywhere are caught right in the crossfire of international conflicts. Reflecting on this whole ordeal, Rector Schutze noted something I think is really important. He said, "It must be the aspiration of a university to find common ground in discussions, even when there are opposing positions." He's a firm believer that universities have to remain spaces for fact-based, objective discussions. Because if they don't, he warns, we risk letting society sink even deeper into this populist culture war, where everyone is just screaming their ideologies at each other without exchanging any actual grounded arguments. Which leaves us with a pretty profound thought to wrap up today's explainer. How exactly will democratic societies keep balancing this vital, historical tradition of university protests with the crazy complexities of global conflicts and radicalization? As the court in Vienna proved, heavy-handed crackdowns can easily trample on civil liberties. But, as the university administration pointed out, unchecked rhetoric can deeply threaten the safety of marginalized students. It's a razor-thin line, guys, and as global tensions keep rising, it is a line we're all going to have to figure out how to walk together. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today. I really hope this deep dive gave you the clarity to understand exactly what's sitting on both sides of those scales of justice.